"Call me immediately," my lawyer warned. The dark truth about my daughter-in-law left me frozen. The phone rang at 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I was staring at my bedside clock, unable to sleep for the third night in a row. Something had been gnawing at me, a mother's intuition that wouldn't let go. When I saw my lawyer's name flashing on the screen at that ungodly hour, my blood turned to ice. "Mrs. Washington, I need you to call me the moment you get this message. Don't talk to anyone else first. Don't even talk to your son. This is about your daughter-in-law and what I've discovered. It's going to change everything." My name is Patricia Washington, and I thought I knew my family. I thought I understood the woman my son Marcus had married 2 years ago. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be deadly wrong. But let me start from the beginning, because the devil, as they say, is always in the details. The perfect daughter-in-law. When Marcus first brought Sophia home 3 years ago, I'll admit I was skeptical. Not because she was white. Lord knows we'd moved past those old barriers in our family long ago. No, it was something else entirely. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She was too perfect. Sophia Chen, she'd kept her maiden name, which should have been my first red flag, was everything a mother-in-law could want on paper. She was a successful marketing executive at a tech company downtown, drove a pristine BMW, and had a smile that could light up a room. She brought expensive wine to dinner, remembered my birthday, and always complimented my cooking with just the right amount of enthusiasm. "Mrs. Washington, this cornbread is absolutely divine. You simply must give me the recipe," she'd gush, her manicured hands pressed together in apparent delight. But here's the thing about perfection. It's usually hiding something ugly underneath. My late husband Jerome used to say, "Pat, when someone's trying too hard to impress you, ask yourself what they're trying to distract you from." Jerome had been gone 5 years now, but his wisdom still echoed in my head during those early dinners with Sophia. Marcus, my only child, was completely smitten. At 32, he'd finally found someone who seemed to match his ambition and drive. He was a successful architect, had his own firm, and Sophia appeared to complement him perfectly. They lived in a beautiful townhouse in Georgetown, took exotic vacations, and posted picture-perfect moments on social media. But I noticed things, like how Sophia's eyes never quite smiled when her mouth did, how she asked detailed questions about our family history, our finances, our property holdings, questions that seemed innocent enough but felt oddly invasive. How she always steered conversations away from her own past, deflecting with practiced ease whenever I asked about her childhood or her family. "Oh, Mrs. Washington, my family is terribly boring compared to yours," she'd laugh, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm much more interested in hearing about Marcus as a little boy. I bet he was adorable." The deflection was smooth, expert even, but it was still deflection, the first crack in the facade. The first real warning sign came during Thanksgiving last year. I was hosting, as I had every year since Jerome passed. It was important to me to maintain our family traditions, to keep our home as the gathering place where stories were shared and memories were made. Marcus and Sophia arrived early to help with preparations, and I was grateful for the extra hands. I was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on my famous sweet potato casserole, when I overheard Sophia on the phone in the living room. She was speaking in what sounded like Mandarin, her voice low and urgent. I don't speak the language, but I know the difference between casual conversation and something serious. When she returned to the kitchen, her perfect smile was back in place. "Everything all right, honey?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "Oh, just work stuff," she said breezily. "You know how it is. Clients in different time zones." But it was Thanksgiving Day. What clients would be calling on Thanksgiving Day? Later that evening, after our guests had left and Marcus was loading the dishwasher, I casually mentioned the phone call to Sophia. Her face went completely blank for just a moment, a micro expression that lasted maybe half a second before the smile returned. but I caught it. That flash of something cold and calculating that made my skin crawl. "I don't recall making any calls today," she said smoothly. "You must have misheard the TV or something." She was lying. I knew she was lying, but more importantly, she was good at it. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd glimpsed something real beneath Sophia's carefully constructed exterior. Something that made me want to protect my son, even though I couldn't articulate why. Mother's intuition. Over the following months, I started paying closer attention. Not snooping, I'm not that kind of mother-in-law, but observing, listening, asking casual questions and noting the answers. I learned that Sophia claimed to have grown up in San Francisco, but she once mentioned a childhood memory of snow that didn't match California weather patterns. She said her parents were deceased, but I caught her making references to them in present tense before quickly correcting herself. Most troubling of all, I noticed that Marcus was changing. My son had always been open with me. We talked regularly, shared our worries and celebrations, but gradually, those conversations became more superficial. When I asked about work, his answers became vague. When I suggested family activities, he started declining more often. "Sorry, Mom, but Sophia's got this work thing," became his standard excuse. It wasn't just that he was spending less time with family, it was that he seemed dimmer somehow, less vibrant, like someone had turned down his brightness. One evening in March, I decided to be direct. "Marcus, honey, are you happy?" I asked during one of our increasingly rare phone conversations. There was a long pause. Too long. "Of course I'm happy, Mom. Why would you ask that?" "You just seem different lately. Distant." Another pause. Then, "Marriage is an adjustment, you know. We're still figuring things out." But his voice sounded hollow, like he was reciting lines from a script. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I Googled my daughter-in-law. Digital ghost. What I found, or rather what I didn't find, chilled me to the bone. Sophia Chen, according to the internet, barely existed before 3 years ago. Oh, there were traces. A LinkedIn profile that claimed employment at various tech companies, but when I looked deeper, the employment histories were vague. A Facebook account with generic photos and minimal personal information. A few professional headshots that looked oddly sterile. But there were no childhood photos, no college memories shared by old friends, no family pictures, no digital footprint of a life actually lived. I'd raised a son in the age of social media. I knew what a real person's online presence looked like. Messy, authentic, full of random moments and genuine connections. Sophia's online presence looked curated, manufactured, fake. I spent hours that night falling down internet rabbit holes, trying to find any trace of Sophia Chen's life before she appeared in Washington, D.C. 3 years ago. The more I searched, the more convinced I became that I was looking at an elaborate construction. But construction of what? And why? The investigation begins. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but I'm not naive either. When something doesn't feel right, there's usually a good reason. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Richard Blackstone had been our family attorney for over 20 years. He'd handled Jerome's will, helped us with some property disputes, and guided Marcus through setting up his architecture firm. More importantly, he was discreet and thorough. "Richard, I need you to do me a favor," I said during our phone call. "I want you to run a background check on someone." "Patricia, that's not really... It's about Marcus. I'm worried about him, and I think his wife isn't who she claims to be." There was a pause. Richard had known Marcus since he was 12 years old. If I was calling with concerns, Richard would take them seriously. What kind of concerns are we talking about? I explained everything. The inconsistencies in her stories, the digital absence, the way Marcus was changing. I tried to sound rational rather than like an overprotective mother, but I could hear the worry in my own voice. Patricia, I can make some discreet inquiries, but you need to understand that if this woman is just private about her past, we could be invading her privacy for no good reason. And if she's not just private, if she's hiding something that could hurt my son? Another pause. Give me a few weeks. I'll see what I can find. Waiting for answers. Those 2 weeks felt like 2 months. I tried to act normally around Marcus and Sophia, but it was increasingly difficult. Every interaction felt loaded with subtext. Every smile from Sophia seemed more artificial. Every deflection more suspicious. The worst part was watching my son. Marcus had always been confident, decisive. But around Sophia, he'd become almost deferential. He asked her permission for things he'd never needed permission for before. He'd stopped making plans without consulting her first. During a family barbecue in April, I watched them interact with our extended family. Sophia was charming as always, asking thoughtful questions and sharing just enough personal anecdotes to seem engaged without revealing anything substantial. But I noticed something else. She was studying people. Not socializing, studying. She asked pointed questions about people's jobs, their financial situations, their family dynamics, and she remembered everything. When my nephew Tony mentioned that he was going through a difficult divorce, Sophia's interest sharpened. She asked follow-up questions about assets, custody arrangements, legal representation, all framed as sympathetic concern, but it felt more like intelligence gathering. She's taking notes, I thought to myself. But notes for what? The phone call that changed everything. Richard called me on a Thursday evening at 9:23 p.m. I remember because I was watching the news, trying to distract myself from the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. Patricia, we need to talk, not over the phone. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? Richard, you're scaring me. Is it that bad? It's complicated. But yes, it's bad. How much do you know about identity theft on a large scale? My blood turned to ice. What do you mean? I mean, the woman your son married doesn't exist. The real Sophia Chen died in a car accident in Portland, Oregon 8 years ago. Whoever is living in your son's house has stolen a dead woman's identity and built an entire life around it. The room started spinning. I had to sit down. Patricia, are you still there? I'm here, I whispered. Richard? What does this mean? What does she want? That's what we need to figure out, and we need to figure it out fast because I think your son might be in danger. The real Sophia Chen. The next morning, I sat in Richard's office staring at a file that contained the most terrifying information I'd ever seen. The real Sophia Chen had been 26 years old when she died in Portland. She was a marketing executive. That part was true. She'd been single, no children, parents deceased. She was, in many ways, the perfect identity to steal. Someone with a professional background but minimal family connections to notice the theft. The fake Sophia had done her homework. She'd somehow gained access to the real Sophia's social security number, her educational credentials, her employment history. She'd built an entire persona around a dead woman's life, filling in the gaps with carefully constructed lies. But that wasn't the worst part. Patricia, I need you to prepare yourself for what I'm about to tell you, Richard said, his expression grim. This kind of identity theft, this level of sophistication, it's not random. It's not even about financial gain, at least not directly. What do you mean? I mean, someone went to enormous effort and expense to create this false identity. The question is why? What was the end goal? He slid another document across the desk. It was a property deed. Marcus's townhouse, the one he'd owned outright before his marriage. She convinced him to add her name to the deed 6 months ago for estate planning purposes, according to the paperwork. My heart sank. She's after his money. That's what I thought initially, but Patricia, your son isn't wealthy enough to justify this level of elaborate fraud. This operation would have cost tens of thousands of dollars to pull off. The return on investment doesn't make sense for a simple gold-digging scheme. Then what? I think she's after something bigger, or someone is. This feels like organized crime, Patricia. Professional-level deception. The dark web of deception. Richard had contacted a private investigator who specialized in identity fraud. What they uncovered over the next week painted a picture so disturbing that I could barely process it. The fake Sophia wasn't working alone. The investigator had traced financial connections that suggested she was part of a larger network. Money had been moving through various accounts, some of them offshore. Communication patterns suggested coordination with other parties. Mrs. Washington, the investigator, a serious woman named Detective Reynolds, explained during our meeting, "We believe your daughter-in-law is part of what's called a long con. This is a sophisticated operation designed to infiltrate and exploit specific targets over extended periods." But why Marcus? He's successful, but he's not rich enough to... It might not be about his money directly. Does your son have access to sensitive information through his work, government contracts, high-profile clients? My mouth went dry. Marcus's architectural firm had indeed worked on several government projects, federal buildings, secure facilities. He had security clearances. "Oh my God," I whispered. "We think she might be gathering intelligence, corporate espionage, possibly even foreign intelligence gathering." The room was spinning again. My son hadn't just married a gold digger or even a common criminal. He'd married a spy. Racing against time. "We need to get Marcus away from her immediately," I said, standing up abruptly. "Mrs. Washington, wait," Detective Reynolds said. "If we move too quickly, we could put your son in danger. These people don't just disappear quietly when their cover is blown. They eliminate loose ends." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You think she might hurt him?" "I think she might already be planning to. We found evidence that she's been researching life insurance policies, big ones, and she's been asking questions about your son's medical history." I felt like I was going to be sick. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We build an airtight case first. We gather enough evidence to ensure she can be arrested and prosecuted. And we do it all without alerting her that we know." "How long will that take?" "A few more weeks, maybe a month." "A month?" I stood up, panic rising in my chest. "I can't leave my son with that woman for another month." Richard put a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Patricia, I know this is terrifying, but if we move too fast, we could lose her entirely. And worse, we could put Marcus in immediate danger." The longest weeks, the next 3 weeks, were the longest of my life. I had to pretend everything was normal. I attended family dinners where I sat across from a woman I now knew was a dangerous criminal. I made small talk with someone who might be planning to murder my son. I smiled and nodded while my heart pounded with terror. The worst part was that I couldn't warn Marcus. Detective Reynolds and Richard had been adamant. Marcus couldn't know until they were ready to move. His behavior might change in ways that would alert Sophia, and if she suspected anything, she might accelerate whatever timeline she was working on. So I watched my son, looking for signs that he was in immediate danger, while trying to act like the same mother-in-law I'd always been. I started finding excuses to visit more often. "I was in the neighborhood. I brought you some leftover soup. I wanted to see how you're doing." Marcus seemed genuinely happy to see me more often, which broke my heart. He had no idea that his loving mother was actually conducting surveillance operations. During one of these visits, I made a discovery that nearly made me scream. The discovery. I was helping with dishes after dinner when I accidentally knocked over Sophia's purse. The contents spilled across the kitchen floor, and as I bent to help gather them up, I saw something that made my blood freeze. A small digital recorder, the kind used for covert recording. Sophia moved quickly to scoop it up, but not before I got a good look at it. "Clumsy me," she laughed, stuffing everything back into her purse. "Always carrying too much junk." But her laugh was different this time. Tighter. more controlled. She knew I'd seen it. That night, I called Richard from my car before I even left their driveway. "She's recording him," I whispered into the phone. "Richard, she's recording my son's conversations." "Are you sure?" I saw the device, a small digital recorder. "She's gathering evidence of something." "Patricia, I need you to stay calm. We're almost ready to move. Detective Reynolds thinks we'll have enough evidence to make arrests within the week." "Arrests? Plural?" "She's not working alone, Patricia. We've identified at least 3 other individuals involved in this operation. It's bigger than we initially thought." The final pieces. The truth, when it fully emerged, was more elaborate and terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The fake Sophia was part of an international espionage ring. Her real name was Li Wei, and she was a Chinese national who'd been trained specifically for long-term intelligence operations in the United States. Marcus had been targeted not just for his security clearances, but because his architectural firm had been selected to design a new NSA facility. The recordings she'd been making captured Marcus discussing classified aspects of the project. The life insurance policies weren't just about money. They were about creating a situation where she could disappear with valuable intelligence after Marcus's convenient, accidental death. But the most chilling discovery was the timeline. She'd been planning to execute her exit strategy within the next 2 weeks. The sting operation Detective Reynolds and the FBI set up an elaborate sting operation. They'd identified the other members of Li Wei's network and planned to arrest them simultaneously to prevent anyone from escaping or warning the others. My role was to act as bait. "Mrs. Washington, we need you to invite them to dinner, a normal family dinner. Can you do that without arousing suspicion?" Could I sit across from my son and his would-be killer and act like everything was normal? Could I serve dinner to a woman who was planning to murder my child and make pleasant conversation? "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my son," I told them. The Last Supper. The dinner was planned for a Saturday evening. I invited Marcus and Sophia over for what I told them would be a celebration of my recent promotion at the community center where I worked part-time. It was a plausible excuse for a special dinner. I spent the entire day cooking, trying to keep my hands busy so they wouldn't shake. Pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, and peach cobbler for dessert, all of Marcus's favorites. If this was going to be our last normal family dinner, I wanted it to be perfect. They arrived at 6 p.m. exactly. Marcus brought flowers, yellow roses, my favorites. Li Wei brought an expensive bottle of wine, as always. "Mrs. Washington, something smells absolutely divine," she gushed, her performance as flawless as ever. I looked at this woman who had been planning to kill my son and smiled back. "Thank you, dear. I hope you're hungry." For 2 hours, I served dinner to my son's would-be murderer. We talked about work, about the weather, about plans for the upcoming holidays. Li Wei was charming and attentive, asking thoughtful questions and complimenting my cooking. If I hadn't known the truth, I would have thought she was the perfect daughter-in-law. But I did know the truth, and every smile she gave me felt like a knife twisting in my gut. The arrest. At exactly 8:17 p.m., there was a knock at the door. "I'll get it," I said, standing up from the table. Marcus started to rise. "Mom, I can—" "No, honey, you stay with Sophia. I've got it." I opened the door to find Detective Reynolds and 6 federal agents. "Patricia Washington," she said loudly enough for the dining room to hear, "we need to speak with you about some charges that have been filed against you." This was the plan, make it look like I was being arrested so that Li Wei wouldn't suspect a trap. I heard chairs scraping in the dining room as Marcus and Li Wei stood up. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus called out. That's when the agents moved past me into the house. "Li Wei, also known as Sophia Chen, you're under arrest for espionage, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder." The look on her face when she heard her real name was something I'll never forget. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely. The sweet, charming woman I'd known for 2 years disappeared. replaced by someone cold and calculating and utterly without humanity. Marcus was staring in shock. "What are you talking about? Her name is Sophia, not Marcus Washington. You're not under arrest, but we need to speak with you immediately. You've been the target of a foreign intelligence operation." I watched my son's world collapse in real time. The confusion, the disbelief, the slow dawning horror as he began to understand that the woman he'd married, the woman he'd been living with for 2 years, was not only a stranger, but someone who'd been planning to kill him. Li Wei didn't go quietly. Even with handcuffs on, she was defiant. "You have no idea what you've done," she said to me as they led her past where I stood in the doorway. "This is much bigger than one small-minded woman and her precious son." "Maybe," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice was. But my small-minded protection just saved his life. The aftermath. The investigation revealed the full scope of the operation. Li Wei and her associates had been operating in the United States for over 5 years, targeting individuals with access to sensitive information. Marcus was one of 7 men who had been infiltrated, manipulated, and marked for elimination once their usefulness ended. 3 of the other targets hadn't been as fortunate. Their deaths had been ruled accidental, but the FBI now suspected murder. Marcus struggled with the revelation as anyone would. The woman he'd thought he loved, the person he'd shared his bed and his secrets with, had never existed. The real person behind that face had been planning his death. He moved back in with me temporarily while he worked through the trauma with a therapist. We spent long evenings talking, sometimes crying, slowly rebuilding the trust that Li Wei's deception had damaged. "Mom," he said one night, about a month after the arrest, "how did you know? What made you suspicious when I couldn't see it?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I think it was because I loved you more than I wanted to be liked by her," I finally said. "She was working so hard to make me approve of her, but approval isn't the same as trust. And when someone is trying that hard to be perfect, it usually means they're hiding something imperfect." "But I loved her," he said quietly. "Or I thought I did. How could I have been so blind?" "Baby, she was a professional. This is what she was trained to do. She studied you, learned what you wanted, and became that person. That's not love. That's manipulation on a level most people can't even imagine." The trial Li Wei's trial was a media sensation. The story of the Chinese spy who'd infiltrated American families made national headlines. I was called to testify about how I'd first become suspicious and how the investigation had unfolded. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at the woman who'd sat at my dinner table and planned my son's murder, I felt a mixture of anger and pity. She was clearly intelligent, clearly capable. What kind of life had led her to use those gifts for such destructive purposes? During her testimony, Li Wei showed no remorse. She spoke about Marcus as if he'd been nothing more than an assignment, a target to be eliminated when his usefulness ended. "Did you ever feel any genuine emotion toward the defendant, Marcus Washington?" her attorney asked during cross-examination. "Emotion was not part of my mission parameters," she replied without hesitation. Marcus was sitting beside me in the gallery. I felt him flinch at her words, but I also felt his strength. My son was healing, slowly but surely. The experience had wounded him, but it hadn't broken him. Justice and healing Li Wei was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her associates received similar sentences. The broader spy network was dismantled, preventing other families from experiencing what we'd gone through. Marcus gradually began dating again, though he was understandably cautious. The therapist had helped him understand that Li Wei's deception wasn't a reflection of his judgment or worth. It was the result of professional-level manipulation designed to fool anyone. "I'm not ashamed that I fell for it," he told me during one of our regular Sunday dinners. "I'm proud that I'm capable of love and trust, even if someone exploited those qualities." That was when I knew he was going to be okay. Lessons learned people ask me now how they can protect themselves and their families from this kind of deception. The truth is, there's no foolproof method. Professional manipulators are called professionals for a reason. But I've learned that there's power in trusting your instincts, especially when it comes to the people you love. If something feels wrong, there's usually a reason. That doesn't mean being paranoid or suspicious of everyone, but it does mean paying attention to those nagging feelings that something isn't quite right. I've also learned that love sometimes means being the bad guy. If I'd worried more about being liked by Sophia and less about protecting Marcus, the outcome might have been very different. Most importantly, I've learned that family is worth fighting for, even when that fight is complicated and scary and uncertain. The phone call that started it. All these days when the phone rings at 2:47 a.m., my first thought isn't panic. It's usually Marcus calling after working late, wanting to check in or share some news about his day. "Hey, Mom," he'll say, and I can hear the smile in his voice. "I know it's late, but I just wanted to hear your voice." Those calls are precious to me now in a way they never were before. They're proof that my son is safe, that he's healing, that he's still the loving, trusting person I raised him to be despite everything he went through. Sometimes he talks about wanting to find love again, about maybe having children someday. Those conversations fill me with hope and terror in equal measure. Hope that he'll find genuine happiness, terror that someone might try to hurt him again. But I've realized that I can't protect him from everything. What I can do is trust that I raised him to be strong, to recognize red flags, and to know that he always has a mother who will fight for him no matter what. And if anyone ever tries to hurt my family again, they'll discover what Li Wei learned too late. Never underestimate a mother's love or her determination to protect her child. Epilogue. 2 years later. It's been 2 years since Li Wei's arrest, and life has found a new normal. Marcus has his own place again, a beautiful condo downtown with excellent security. He's dating a lovely woman named Angela, a teacher he met through friends. She's the opposite of Li Wei in every way, open about her past, integrated into her family and community, with a digital footprint that goes back to elementary school. More importantly, she makes Marcus laugh. Real, genuine laughter that lights up his whole face. I've learned to trust my instincts without being paranoid, to love without being possessive, and to protect without being overprotective. It's a delicate balance, but one worth maintaining. The community center where I work has asked me to speak to other parents about recognizing signs of manipulation and abuse in their adult children's relationships. It's not easy to talk about, but I've realized that sharing our story might help other families avoid the nightmare we lived through. Sometimes I still wake up at 2:47 a.m. thinking about that phone call from Richard that changed everything. But now, instead of feeling terror, I feel gratitude. Gratitude that I trusted my instincts. Gratitude that I had the courage to investigate. Gratitude that professional, dedicated people like Richard and Detective Reynolds were willing to help us. Most of all, I feel gratitude that my son is alive, safe, and slowly learning to trust and love again. Marcus stopped by yesterday with Angela. They're talking about taking a vacation together, something Marcus hadn't been able to do since Li Wei's arrest. As I watched them planning their trip, seeing the genuine affection and easy communication between them, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. The dark truth about my daughter-in-law had indeed left me frozen with terror for a while, but ultimately it led to something more powerful than fear, the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child, and the knowledge that love, when it's real and fierce and protective, can overcome even the most sophisticated deception. My phone doesn't ring at 2:47 a.m. with emergency calls anymore. When it does ring at unusual hours, it's usually Marcus calling to share good news or just to say goodnight. And every time I hear his voice, safe and happy and free, I'm reminded that sometimes the scariest phone calls lead to the most important victories. The woman who called herself Sophia Chen is serving a life sentence in federal prison. The real Sophia Chen rests peacefully in Portland. Her identity finally returned to her. And my son Marcus, he's learning to love again, surrounded by people who truly care about him. But our story doesn't end there. The ripple effects of Li Wei's deception continue to unfold in ways I never could have anticipated. The other victims, 6 months after Li Wei's conviction, Detective Reynolds contacted me with news that was both heartbreaking and vindicating. The FBI had reopened investigations into the deaths of the other men who had been targeted by Li Wei's network. What they discovered painted an even more chilling picture of the operation's scope and brutality. James Morrison, a defense contractor from Virginia, had died in what was ruled a hiking accident 18 months before Li Wei's arrest. Upon reinvestigation, they found traces of a paralytic drug in tissue samples that had been preserved. His wife of 3 years had disappeared shortly after his death, along with $2.3 million in life insurance payouts and access to classified missile defense systems. Dr. Robert Chen, no relation to the real Sophia Chen, had been a cybersecurity expert for the Department of Homeland Security. His death from an apparent heart attack at age 34 had seemed suspicious to his family, but toxicology reports at the time had been inconclusive. New testing revealed evidence of an untraceable cardiac toxin. His widow, who had been known as Maria Santos, had vanished with both his life insurance money and copies of critical infrastructure security protocols. The third victim, Thomas Bradley, had been an aerospace engineer working on satellite communication systems. His death in a car accident had genuinely appeared accidental until investigators discovered that his vehicle's computer system had been hacked. Someone had remotely disabled his brakes while he was driving on a mountain road. His wife of 18 months, calling herself Jennifer Walsh, had collected a $4 million insurance payout and disappeared. All 3 women had been part of Li Wei's network. All 3 had used similar methods of infiltration, manipulation, and ultimately murder. Mrs. Washington, Detective Reynolds told me during our meeting, your instincts and your courage to act on them didn't just save your son's life. They helped us uncover a murder spree that might have continued indefinitely. The weight of that knowledge was overwhelming. If I had dismissed my concerns, if I had convinced myself that I was just being an overprotective mother, Marcus would have become the 4th victim, and Li Wei would have moved on to her next target, the international connection. As the investigation expanded, it became clear that Li Wei's network was part of a much larger international operation. The Chinese government denied any knowledge or involvement, of course, but intelligence agencies from multiple countries began sharing information about similar operations they'd discovered. The British had uncovered a ring targeting military contractors in London. The Germans had arrested 3 women involved in a scheme to infiltrate aerospace companies. The Australians had discovered that several unexplained deaths among government scientists had actually been assassinations carried out by foreign operatives using the same methods. What emerged was a picture of a coordinated, years-long campaign to steal Western technology and eliminate key personnel who might detect or prevent future espionage operations. Li Wei and her associates weren't just spies. They were part of a systematic effort to undermine national security across multiple allied nations. The FBI briefed me on these developments not because I needed to know, but because they wanted me to understand the full significance of what we'd uncovered. My son hadn't just been targeted for his security clearance or his architectural plans. He'd been selected as part of a broader strategy to compromise American defense capabilities. The NSA facility your son was designing, Agent Martinez explained, would have been a critical component of our next-generation surveillance and cyber defense systems. If Li Wei had succeeded in obtaining those plans and eliminating the lead architect, it would have set back our national security infrastructure by years. The implications were staggering. A mother's protective instincts had inadvertently foiled an international espionage operation that could have compromised national security for decades. The psychological aftermath. While the broader implications were significant, the personal aftermath for our family was equally complex. Marcus struggled not just with the betrayal and attempted murder, but with questions about his own judgment and his ability to trust anyone again. "Mom," he said during one of our regular therapy sessions. Yes, I had started attending some sessions with him to help us both process the trauma. "How do I know I won't fall for something like this again? How do I trust my own instincts when they failed so completely?" Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the trauma specialist who was helping us both, addressed this concern directly. "Marcus, you didn't fail. You were targeted by someone who had received years of professional training in psychological manipulation. You responded normally to someone who was abnormally skilled at deception. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two different things." Marcus went through periods of anger, depression, and self-doubt that were painful to watch. There were days when he couldn't get out of bed, overwhelmed by the realization of how close he'd come to death and how completely he'd been deceived. I struggled with my own psychological aftermath as well. I found myself scrutinizing every new person who entered our lives with an intensity that bordered on paranoia. When Marcus started dating Angela, I ran extensive background checks on her without telling either of them. I researched her family, her employment history, her social media presence, looking for any inconsistencies that might suggest deception. It took months of therapy for me to find a balance between reasonable caution and destructive suspicion. The media circus. When Li Wei's trial began, our story became national news. The idea of a Chinese spy infiltrating American families through fake marriages captured the public imagination in ways that were both helpful and harmful. On the positive side, the media attention led to increased awareness about sophisticated identity theft and international espionage operations. Several people came forward with concerns about relationships that had seemed suspicious, leading to additional investigations and arrests. But the negative aspects were significant as well. Our family was thrust into a spotlight we hadn't asked for. Reporters showed up at my house, at Marcus's office, even at the community center where I worked. Every detail of our lives was scrutinized and often misrepresented. Marcus struggled particularly with the loss of privacy. "I feel like my entire life has become public property," he told me. "Not just the parts involving Li Wei, but everything. My work, my relationships, even my therapy sessions. Nothing feels private anymore." We had to hire our own security team after receiving threats from people who somehow blamed us for the international incident. Some accused us of being anti-Chinese racists who had fabricated the entire story. Others suggested that we were government agents ourselves, using the spy story as a cover for our own intelligence activities. The threats were credible enough that the FBI assigned protective details to both Marcus and me for several months. It was surreal, going from a normal family to having federal agents escorting us to the grocery store. The trial testimony. Testifying at Li Wei's trial was one of the most difficult experiences of my life. Sitting in that courtroom, recounting every detail of how I'd gradually become suspicious of my daughter-in-law, felt like reliving a nightmare. Li Wei's defense attorney, a sharp woman named Catherine Walsh, attempted to portray me as a racist, overprotective mother who had fabricated evidence because I disapproved of my son's interracial marriage. "Mrs. Washington," she said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you never fully accepted your son's relationship with my client because she was Asian?" "That's absolutely false," I replied. My concerns had nothing to do with her ethnicity and everything to do with inconsistencies in her stories and behavior that suggested deception. "But you admit that you began investigating her background without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing?" "I investigated because a mother's instinct told me something was wrong, and I was right." The defense strategy was predictable, but still infuriating. They tried to paint the entire investigation as the result of racial prejudice rather than legitimate security concerns. They suggested that the evidence had been fabricated or misinterpreted to support a predetermined conclusion, but the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had recovered detailed plans from Li Wei's apartment showing Marcus's murder, financial records proving her connection to the broader spy network, and recordings of her communications with her handlers in China. When Marcus testified, describing how Li Wei had manipulated him and gradually gained access to his work and personal information, the courtroom was completely silent. His pain was evident, but so was his strength and his determination to see justice done. "She studied me like a science project," he said. "Every conversation, every intimate moment, every expression of love. It was all calculated to achieve her mission objectives. She never saw me as a human being. I was just a target to be exploited and eliminated." Li Wei showed no emotion during his testimony. She sat at the defense table taking notes, occasionally whispering to her attorneys, but displaying no remorse or recognition of the harm she had caused. The verdict and sentencing. When the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The trial had lasted 4 months, during which our lives had been dissected and scrutinized by lawyers, journalists, and the public. Li Wei's sentencing hearing provided the first opportunity for our family to directly address her and express the impact of her crimes. Marcus spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. "You stole 2 years of my life," he said, looking directly at Li Wei. "You made me doubt my ability to trust, to love, to form genuine relationships. You planned to murder me and steal everything I had worked for, but you failed. And your failure revealed a strength in my family and in our country that you clearly didn't understand." When it was my turn to speak, I had prepared elaborate remarks about the pain and fear her actions had caused. But standing there, looking at this woman who had sat at my dinner table and planned my son's death, I found myself saying something simpler and more direct. "You underestimated a mother's love," I said. "That was your fatal mistake. And it's a mistake that saved not just my son's life, but the lives of future victims you would have targeted." Li Wei was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. I expected her to maintain her innocence or offer some form of apology. Instead, she stood and delivered a chilling statement that revealed the depth of her commitment to her cause. "I regret nothing," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "I served my country as I was trained to do. Your laws and your emotions are irrelevant to me. The only regret I have is that my mission was not completed successfully." The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 50 years for the espionage charges. As she was led away, Li Wei looked back at our family one last time, her expression as cold and calculating as it had been on the night of her arrest. Rebuilding trust. In the months following the trial, Marcus and I began the slow process of rebuilding not just our sense of security, but our ability to trust new people and form new relationships. For Marcus, this meant learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. He started dating again gradually, meeting women through friends and family rather than through dating apps or chance encounters. Each relationship was a step toward healing, even when they didn't work out romantically. Angela entered his life about 18 months after Li Wei's arrest. She was a third-grade teacher at an elementary school where Marcus had been hired to design a new playground. Their first conversations were about swing sets and monkey bars, hardly the stuff of romantic intrigue. What impressed me most about Angela was her patience with Marcus's healing process. She understood that his previous relationship had been traumatic and didn't push him to move faster than he was comfortable with. When he was ready to introduce her to family, she met us naturally and without pressure. Unlike Li Wei, Angela came with a complete, verifiable life story. She had college friends who still called her, parents who visited regularly, and a sister who teased her mercilessly about her crush on Marcus. Her social media presence went back over a decade and was filled with the kind of authentic, messy moments that characterize real life rather than constructed personas. Most importantly, she made Marcus laugh. Real, spontaneous laughter that reminded me of the son I'd known before Li Wei entered our lives. The ongoing investigation, even after Li Wei's conviction, the investigation into her network continued. The FBI and international intelligence agencies worked to identify and apprehend other members of the spy ring, as well as to understand the full scope of their operations. Detective Reynolds kept me informed of major developments, both because of my role in the initial investigation and because some aspects of the ongoing case continued to affect our family's security. Mrs. Washington, she told me during one of our regular briefings, we've identified at least 12 other operatives who were part of Li Wei's network. Most of them have been arrested, but 3 are still at large. We have no reason to believe they pose any direct threat to your family, but we want you to remain vigilant. The thought that Li Wei's associates were still free was unsettling, but I'd learned to live with a certain level of uncertainty. The alternative, living in constant fear, would have meant letting them win even after their leader's conviction. More disturbing was the discovery that the spy network had been operating for much longer than initially suspected. Evidence suggested that similar operations had been active for over a decade, with multiple generations of operatives being trained and deployed to infiltrate American families and institutions. The sophistication of this operation suggests state-level planning and resources. Agent Martinez explained, this wasn't a rogue operation by a few individuals. It was a systematic, long-term intelligence campaign designed to compromise American national security from within. The implications extended far beyond our personal experience. Congressional hearings were held. Intelligence agencies revised their security protocols. New legislation was introduced to address the specific vulnerabilities that Li Wei's network had exploited. In a strange way, our family's trauma had contributed to strengthening national security measures that would protect other families from similar threats. Letters from prison. About a year after Li Wei's conviction, I received something I never expected, a letter from her in prison. The letter was brief and written in perfect English with no hint of the charming persona she had maintained for 2 years. It was clinical, almost academic in tone, as if she were analyzing our case from a professional perspective. Mrs. Washington, it read, I write not to apologize as I have no regrets about my actions, but to acknowledge your effectiveness as an adversary. Your maternal instincts proved more formidable than our intelligence assessments had predicted. This is valuable information that will be incorporated into future operational planning. The letter was disturbing on multiple levels. First, it confirmed that Li Wei felt no remorse for her actions or recognition of their human cost. Second, it suggested that she still considered herself part of an ongoing operation that would continue despite her imprisonment. Most chilling was the clinical way she analyzed our family's response to her deception, as if we were test subjects rather than people whose lives she had nearly destroyed. I showed the letter to Detective Reynolds, who confirmed that it was consistent with Li Wei's behavior since her arrest. She's been completely uncooperative with our investigation, Reynolds explained. She views her imprisonment as a temporary setback rather than a consequence of her crimes. Our psychological evaluation suggests she remains committed to her original mission despite its failure. The FBI recommended that I not respond to the letter, but they used it as additional evidence of Li Wei's ongoing threat level and lack of rehabilitation potential. Over the following months, I received 2 more letters from Li Wei, each one analyzing different aspects of how our family had detected and defeated her operation. She wrote about my investigation methods, Marcus's behavioral changes during the final weeks, and the effectiveness of the FBI's sting operation. Reading these letters was like receiving strategic debriefings from an enemy intelligence operative who viewed our lives as nothing more than data points in a larger operational analysis. I stopped reading them after the third one and instructed the prison to stop forwarding her correspondence to me. The anniversary. 2 years after Lee Wei's arrest, our family faced the difficult question of how to acknowledge the anniversary of that traumatic night. Should we ignore it and try to move forward? Should we mark it as a day of gratitude for Marcus's survival? Should we use it as an opportunity to process the ongoing effects of the trauma? Marcus and I decided to handle it together, along with Angela, who had become an important part of our healing process. We planned a quiet dinner at my house, not to celebrate Lee Wei's arrest, but to acknowledge how far we'd come in our recovery. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over, Marcus said as we sat around the same dining room table where Lee Wei had been arrested. Not just because someone was planning to kill me, but because I felt like I could never trust my own judgment again. Tonight, sitting here with people I love and who love me genuinely, I realized that wasn't true. Angela reached over and took his hand. "Trust isn't about being invulnerable to deception," she said. "It's about being brave enough to open your heart despite the risk of being hurt." I looked around the table at these two people who had become so important to my son's healing, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in 2 years. Complete peace of mind about the people in our lives. We had learned to trust again, but it was a different kind of trust. More cautious, more informed, but ultimately more valuable because it was based on genuine knowledge rather than naive assumptions. The proposal. 6 months later, Marcus called me on a Sunday morning with news that filled my heart with joy and terror in equal measure. "Mom, I'm going to ask Angela to marry me." My first instinct was panic. The memory of Lee Wei's deception was still fresh enough to make me fear any major relationship milestone. But as Marcus described his plans and his feelings for Angela, I realized that my fears were based on past trauma rather than present reality. Angela wasn't Lee Wei. She had a real past, real relationships, real flaws and vulnerabilities that made her human rather than a carefully constructed persona. She had been patient with Marcus's healing process, understanding about our family's paranoia, and genuine in her affection for both of us. "Have you thought about a prenup?" I asked, my practical mother instincts kicking in. Marcus laughed. "Yes, Mom, we've discussed it. Angela actually suggested it herself. She wants everything to be transparent and legal so there are never any questions about her motives." That response told me everything I needed to know about Angela's character. Lee Wei would never have suggested a prenuptial agreement because it would have interfered with her plans to access Marcus's assets and life insurance. The proposal itself was perfect, simple, intimate, and nothing like the elaborate romantic gestures that Lee Wei had orchestrated to manipulate Marcus's emotions. Marcus cooked dinner at his apartment, and after they finished eating, he simply said, "I love you, and I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Angela said yes, of course, and when they called to tell me the news, I could hear the genuine joy and excitement in both their voices. Planning a future. As Marcus and Angela began planning their wedding, I found myself in the strange position of being excited about my son's marriage, while simultaneously dealing with ongoing reminders of his previous relationship. The FBI occasionally needed additional information for related cases. Congressional investigators asked me to testify about intelligence vulnerabilities. Journalists still called periodically, wanting to do follow-up stories about the spy ring. Each of these interactions forced me to relive aspects of the Lee Wei experience. But they also reminded me of how much our family had grown and healed since that terrifying night. Angela proved to be a remarkable partner for Marcus during this process. She never showed jealousy or resentment about the attention that Lee Wei's memory still commanded in our lives. Instead, she supported Marcus through the difficult moments and helped him focus on building their future together. "I'm not competing with a ghost," she told me during one of our conversations about the upcoming wedding. What happened to Marcus was traumatic, but it also taught him valuable lessons about love and trust. I'm not trying to make him forget his past. I'm just trying to help him build a better future. That wisdom and maturity convinced me completely that Marcus had found someone worthy of his love and trust. The wedding, Marcus and Angela's wedding, was everything that Lee Wei would have orchestrated it not to be. Small, intimate, and focused on genuine emotion rather than elaborate display. They were married in the same church where Marcus had been baptized, surrounded by family and close friends who had known them both for years. Angela's parents flew in from California, her sister served as maid of honor, and Marcus's college roommate was his best man. As I watched my son exchange vows with a woman who truly loved him, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. Lee Wei's deception had nearly destroyed our family, but ultimately it had made us stronger and more appreciative of genuine love when we found it. During the reception, I gave a toast that I had spent weeks crafting. I wanted to acknowledge the difficult path that had led us here without letting Lee Wei's memory overshadow this joyful occasion. 2 years ago, our family learned that love and trust are precious gifts that must be protected, I said, raising my glass. Today, we celebrate Marcus and Angela for having the courage to love completely and authentically despite the risks. Their love reminds us that while deception may fool us temporarily, genuine affection and commitment always reveal themselves over time. Marcus stood up and hugged me, tears in his eyes. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered, "for protecting me when I couldn't protect myself and for teaching me that real love is worth the risk." Full circle. As I write this, 3 years have passed since Lee Wei's arrest. Marcus and Angela have been married for 8 months and are talking about starting a family. The thought of grandchildren fills me with excitement and, I'll admit, a certain amount of protective anxiety that I'm working to keep in perspective. Lee Wei remains in federal prison, serving her life sentence without the possibility of parole. The other members of her network have been either convicted or deported. The international intelligence operation they were part of has been dismantled, though I'm sure other threats continue to emerge. Our family has found a new normal that incorporates the lessons we learned without being paralyzed by the trauma we experienced. We're more cautious about new relationships, more aware of potential security threats, and more grateful for the genuine love and trust we share. Marcus has returned to his architectural practice with renewed passion. The NSA facility he was originally designing was completed under enhanced security protocols, and he's been hired for several other government projects that benefit from his unique understanding of operational security requirements. I continue to speak at community events about recognizing signs of manipulation and fraud in relationships. It's not easy to talk about our experience publicly, but I've learned that sharing our story helps other families protect themselves from similar threats. Most importantly, I've learned that a mother's protective instincts, when combined with courage and determination, can overcome even the most sophisticated deception. Lee Wei may have been a trained professional, but she underestimated the power of genuine love and family loyalty. The phone still rings occasionally at 2:47 a.m., but now it's usually Angela calling to tell me they've felt the baby kick or Marcus checking in after working late on a project. Those calls fill me with joy rather than terror, reminding me that we survived the darkness and found our way back to the light. In the end, that's all any family can hope for: to protect each other, to heal together, and to never stop believing in the possibility of genuine love and trust, even after experiencing the worst kinds of deception. The dark truth about my daughter-in-law left me frozen with fear for a time, but ultimately it led to a deeper understanding of what real family means and how precious, authentic relationships truly are.